In 1916, a wealthy timber merchant stood on the shores of Lake Union in Seattle, Washington, staring at a broken-down seaplane he had just paid $10,000 to buy from a man who couldn't fix it. His name was William Edward Boeing. He was 34 years old. He had no engineering degree, no aviation experience, and no business building aircraft whatsoever. His only qualification was that he was stubborn, had money, and was deeply, irrationally convinced that the men who built that broken seaplane simply weren't doing it right. "I think we could build a better one," he told his friend Conrad Westervelt, a Navy engineer. That sentence launched the most consequential aviation company in the history of the world. But before Boeing became the titan that put 747s in the sky and built the space shuttle, it was something almost laughably humble, a shed full of men building airplanes out of wood, fabric, and spruce lumber, the same material William Boeing used to build houses. What happened between that leaky wooden seaplane in 1916 and the 200-employee aerospace colossus of today is one of the greatest industrial stories America has ever produced, full of near bankruptcies, government betrayals, wartime miracles, and decisions made by engineers who refuse to accept the word impossible. If you've ever looked up at a contrail cutting across a blue sky and wondered how we got here, stay with me, because this story will completely change the way you see every single airplane you ever fly in. And number one on our list is going to reveal the one decision that almost destroyed Boeing forever and ended up saving commercial aviation as we know it. Boeing's story doesn't begin in a factory. It begins in a forest. William Boeing's father was a German immigrant named Wilhelm Boeing, who made a fortune in iron ore and timber in Michigan and Minnesota. When Wilhelm died in 1890, his son William inherited significant wealth and moved to the Pacific Northwest to manage timber operations. This is crucial context that most Boeing histories gloss over. The man who founded the world's greatest airplane company was a lumberman. He understood wood the way a chef understands ingredients. He knew its grain, its flexibility, its weight-to-strength ratios, the way moisture affected its behavior, how to laminate it and steam bend it and cure it. When he looked at that broken seaplane on Lake Union, he didn't see an engineering impossibility. He saw bad carpentry. He saw someone who didn't know wood. And he believed, with the absolute certainty of a man who had spent his entire professional life working with timber, that he could do better. That instinct, rooted in forestry, not aeronautics, would define Boeing Aircraft Company's first 2 decades of existence. The first aircraft William Boeing built was called the B&W seaplane, named for himself and Conrad Westervelt. They built it in a boathouse on Lake Union using spruce wood, the same Sitka spruce used in high-end furniture and musical instruments, prized for its extraordinary stiffness-to-weight ratio. They hired Herb Munter, a self-taught pilot and mechanic who had learned to fly by crashing repeatedly and surviving, as their test pilot. Munter flew the B&W for the first time in June 1916 and reported that it handled better than anything he'd flown before. Boeing was elated. He immediately offered to sell a pair of them to the U.S. Navy for $10, RON each. The Navy declined. They already had better planes from established manufacturers, they said. Boeing was not discouraged. He incorporated Boeing Airplane Company on July 15, 1916, hired 21 workers, and began building planes nobody had ordered yet, betting that if he built something good enough, someone would eventually buy it. This is a pattern that would repeat itself throughout Boeing's history, building the thing first, finding the customer second. In 1917, the United States entered World War I, and the military suddenly needed aircraft, thousands of them. Boeing's timing was remarkable. He had a functional factory, trained workers, and a reliable aircraft design at exactly the moment the government desperately needed all three. The Navy ordered 50 Model C seaplanes from Boeing, the first significant production contract in the company's history. Boeing built them out of spruce and linen, the same materials everyone else was using, but with a level of quality control that was unusual for the era. Each plane was hand-inspected by Boeing personally. He was known to walk the factory floor and reject aircraft that didn't meet his standards, sometimes disassembling completed planes and forcing workers to rebuild sections that had minor structural flaws, invisible to any test except close examination. Workers found this maddening. Boeing found it non-negotiable. The aircraft that left his factory would not kill pilots because of sloppy workmanship. This obsession with quality, instilled in those first wooden planes, became the foundational cultural value of the company for the next century. After World War I ended in 1918, the military contracts dried up overnight. Boeing found himself with a full factory, dozens of trained workers, and almost no orders. Rather than shut down, he pivoted. The company began building bedroom furniture and speedboats, anything that used the same woodworking skills his workers possessed. For 2 years, Boeing Aircraft Company made more money selling flat-pack furniture than airplanes. This is the moment most companies would have dissolved. The airplane business seemed finished. Surplus military planes flooded the market, selling for almost nothing. Why would anyone buy a new aircraft? Boeing's answer was simple: because the new ones he was building were better. While his competitors were trying to sell off their old wartime designs, Boeing was quietly designing the next generation. He hired engineers, brought in university-trained aerodynamicists, and began approaching airplane design as a scientific discipline rather than an artisan trade. The gap between Boeing and its competitors, which would eventually become enormous, began to open in those quiet years of furniture making and boat building. He was investing in the future while everyone else was liquidating the past. The airmail contracts of the early 1920s gave Boeing its lifeline back into aviation. The U.S. Post Office had begun paying private contractors to fly mail between cities, and Boeing won the contract for the Chicago to San Francisco route in 1927. This was one of the most dangerous mail routes in the country, requiring pilots to cross the Rocky Mountains in open cockpit biplanes, often at night, navigating by bonfires lit by farmers along the route. Boeing built a dedicated aircraft for this purpose, the Model 40, which was revolutionary in one specific way. It used an air-cooled radial engine instead of the water-cooled engines everyone else was using. Air-cooled engines were lighter, which meant the Model 40 could carry 2 passengers in addition to its mail payload, effectively letting Boeing charge for 2 revenue streams simultaneously. No competitor could match this economics. Boeing won the mail contract so decisively that it triggered the creation of Boeing Air Transport, the airline that would eventually evolve into United Airlines. William Boeing had accidentally gotten into the passenger airline business while trying to deliver letters. By 1930, Boeing had built something that no other aviation company possessed: a vertically integrated aerospace conglomerate. Boeing Air Transport flew the passengers. Boeing Aircraft built the planes. Pratt & Whitney built the engines. United Aircraft supplied the components. Boeing owned or controlled all of it. This was the largest aviation holding company in the world, and it was making serious money. Then the U.S. government noticed. In 1934, Congress passed the Airmail Act, which made it illegal for companies that manufactured aircraft to also own airlines. William Boeing was furious. He had spent 18 years building this empire piece by piece, and the government was dismantling it in a single legislative stroke. He sold his stock and left the company he had founded. He was 52 years old and never returned to the aviation business. The man whose name was on the side of every plane was gone. What remained was a company with his DNA but not his presence, and it was about to face its most dangerous decade. Throughout the 1930s, Boeing survived on military contracts and one extraordinarily bold commercial bet: the Boeing 247, the world's first modern airliner. The 247 was a revelation. It had an all-metal fuselage, retractable landing gear, variable pitch propellers, an autopilot, and de-icing equipment, features that no commercial aircraft had ever combined before. It could carry 10 passengers from coast to coast in under 20 hours, cutting the transcontinental travel time nearly in half. United Airlines ordered 60 of them before the plane had even made its first flight, an act of faith that essentially locked out every other airline from getting a 247 for 2 years. Transworld Airlines, furious at being shut out, went to a small California company called Douglas Aircraft and commissioned something better. Douglas built the DC-2, then the DC-3, and those planes dominated commercial aviation for the next 2 decades. Boeing had invented the modern airliner and immediately let its competitor steal the market. It was a humbling lesson in the danger of exclusive arrangements, and one that Boeing engineers would remember for the rest of their careers. The real salvation came from an unexpected direction: the B-17 Flying Fortress. In 1934, the Army Air Corps issued a requirement for a new multi-engine bomber, and most manufacturers submitted twin-engine designs because that's what the specs seemed to suggest. Boeing submitted a 4-engine prototype, the Model 299, which its chief test pilot called a Flying Fortress when he saw it rolled out, a name that stuck forever. The Model 299 could fly farther, higher, and faster than any bomber the military had seen. Then, on its evaluation flight, it crashed. A maintenance crew had forgotten to remove the control surface locks. The Army Air Corps awarded the contract to Douglas instead. Boeing lost the competition through a checklist error. But the Army, impressed by the design despite the crash, ordered 13 evaluation aircraft. Boeing built them, and the B-17 gradually proved so superior to everything else that the Army reversed course entirely. By the time World War II began, the B-17 was the backbone of American strategic bombing. Boeing eventually built 981 of them. The plant in Seattle ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 4 years straight. Women who had never worked in manufacturing became precision metal workers. The factory was camouflaged with fake suburban rooftops to hide it from Japanese bombers. Boeing's workforce grew from 4,000 people in 1939 to 45,000 people in 1944, and crucially, during all of this frantic wartime production, Boeing engineers were quietly drawing the next thing. The thing they were drawing was the B-29 Superfortress, and it was the most technologically complex object human beings had ever attempted to mass produce. The B-29 was pressurized. Its crew could fly at 30,000 feet without oxygen masks. It had a fire control computer that allowed one gunner to remotely aim multiple gun turrets simultaneously. It weighed 60 tons fully loaded. It had a range of nearly 4,000 miles. Nothing like it had ever existed. The engineering challenges were so severe that the B-29 program cost more than the Manhattan Project, $3 billion in 1940s dollars, the equivalent of roughly $50 billion today. The program nearly collapsed multiple times due to engine fires, structural failures, and production bottlenecks so severe that completed B-29s sat on airfields waiting for parts that hadn't arrived yet. Curtis LeMay, the general tasked with using B-29s against Japan, famously described the aircraft as the worst piece of equipment we had. And yet by 1945, B-29s flying from the Mariana Islands were firebombing Tokyo and ultimately delivering the atomic bombs that ended the war. The Enola Gay and Bockscar, the two aircraft that changed the course of history in August 1945, were both Boeing B-29s. The wooden seaplane company from Seattle had built the most consequential weapons in human history. After World War II, Boeing faced the same crisis it had faced after World War I, a sudden end to military contracts. But this time, the company made a different choice. Instead of pivoting to furniture, it pivoted to jets. The engineers who had spent the war pushing piston engines to their absolute limits understood, with crystalline clarity, that the piston engine era was ending. Jet propulsion was the future. Boeing began developing the B-47 Stratojet, a swept-wing jet bomber that incorporated aerodynamic research captured from Nazi Germany after the war. Specifically, German wind tunnel data on swept wings that allowed aircraft to approach the speed of sound without the catastrophic handling problems that plagued straight-wing designs. The B-47 looked like nothing that had ever flown before. It was beautiful and terrifying simultaneously. It could fly at 600 miles per hour at 40,000 feet. Fighter pilots who intercepted it on training exercises reported that they could barely keep up with it. The B-47 convinced the Air Force to order hundreds of them. More importantly, it convinced Boeing's engineers that everything they thought they knew about aircraft design needed to be rethought from scratch, starting with the shape of the wing. The jet transport that would change everything was born from a gamble so large that it genuinely risked destroying the company. In 1952, Boeing's board of directors approved spending $16 million, essentially the entire company's cash reserves at the time, to build a prototype jet airliner and tanker demonstrator, without a single customer or military contract in hand. The aircraft was called the 367-80, nicknamed the Dash 80, and it was built in absolute secrecy because Boeing's leadership was terrified that if competitors or customers learned what they were doing, the project would be copied or killed before it had a chance to prove itself. The Dash 80 first flew on July 15, 1954, exactly 38 years after William Boeing had incorporated his company. It was incomparably better than anything in the sky. It could fly at 550 miles per hour, nearly twice the speed of the piston engine airliners it would replace. It was smooth, powerful, and eerily quiet inside the cabin compared to the deafening roar of propeller aircraft. The Air Force ordered a tanker version, the KC-135 Stratotanker, and Boeing finally had enough revenue to cover its enormous bet. Then came the harder question: would the airlines buy a commercial version? The answer should have been obvious, but it wasn't. Douglas Aircraft was also developing a jet airliner, the DC-8, and the airlines, burned once before by Boeing's exclusive deal with United Airlines on the 247, were reluctant to commit. Douglas was more accommodating, willing to negotiate on specifications, while Boeing was insisting the airlines take the aircraft largely as designed. American Airlines, the country's largest airline at the time, began publicly negotiating with Douglas as a deliberate pressure tactic. Boeing's salesmen were frantic. Then, at an industry gathering in 1955, Boeing's chief test pilot, Tex Johnston, flew the Dash 80 prototype over Lake Washington at an air show and performed not one, but two barrel rolls in front of 250,000 spectators in a full-size prototype jetliner. The crowd went insane. Boeing's president, Bill Allen, reportedly turned white with fury and summoned Johnston immediately. "What did you think you were doing?" Allen demanded. "Selling airplanes," Johnston said. He wasn't wrong. The next day, Boeing had more orders than it could handle. The commercial version of the Dash 80 became the Boeing 707, the aircraft that effectively invented mass commercial aviation as we know it. American Airlines ordered 30 of them. Pan Am ordered 20. Within 5 years, piston engine airliners were obsolete, and the world had permanently changed. The 707 begat a dynasty of aircraft with a family resemblance so strong that mechanics could work on any of them with the same basic training. The narrow-body 727, the most successful commercial jet of the 1960s, used 3 engines mounted at the tail, a design so efficient for medium-haul routes that airlines ordered 832 of them. The 737, introduced in 1968, was designed specifically to be small enough to operate from shorter runways at smaller airports, and it became the best-selling commercial aircraft in aviation history, with over 10,500 orders. Each of these aircraft was essentially an evolution of the same swept-wing aluminum fuselage formula that Boeing had pioneered with the Dash 80, refined, enlarged, and improved with each iteration, but fundamentally recognizable as descendants of that $16 million gamble made in a secret hangar in 1952. Boeing had not just built airplanes. It had built a platform, a family, a philosophy of continuous improvement that allowed it to accumulate institutional knowledge no competitor could easily replicate. Douglas tried. Lockheed tried. Convair tried. All of them eventually abandoned the commercial aviation market, leaving Boeing as the dominant force it remains today. And then came the one. The aircraft that, more than any other, defines what Boeing truly was at its greatest. The 747. In the mid-1960s, Pan Am's Juan Trippe sat down with Boeing's Bill Allen and proposed something that both men knew was insane. An aircraft twice the size of anything that had ever flown commercially. Trippe wanted to democratize air travel, to make flying cheap enough that the middle class could afford it, not just the wealthy. He needed an airplane that could carry 400 passengers. Allen said Boeing could build it. Neither man had any real idea whether that was true. The 747 program began in 1966 with 50 Euro-era engineers, designers, and workers racing against a contractual deadline that Boeing had agreed to without knowing whether the physics would cooperate. The engine Boeing was counting on, the Pratt & Whitney JT9D, had never been built before and kept failing catastrophically during testing. The aircraft itself was so large that Boeing had to build a new factory in Everett, Washington, still the largest building by volume in the world, to assemble it. The program went $2 billion over budget. Boeing borrowed so much money that its bankers literally feared the company would collapse and take several major American banks with it. Workers called the Everett plant the Incredible, a name that captured the mixture of awe and disbelief that pervaded everyone working on it. The 747 flew for the first time on February 9, 1969. It was so large and so capable that it immediately obsoleted the entire concept of air travel exclusivity. Pan Am began flying it commercially in January 1970, and within a year, transatlantic fares had dropped by 40%. By the mid-1970s, middle-class American families who had never been able to afford to fly to Europe were taking vacations to London and Paris. The 747 did more to shrink the world, to make it genuinely accessible to ordinary people, than any other single technology of the 20th century. It carried more than 5 billion passengers over its service life. It inspired generations of engineers, pilots, and dreamers. It appeared in films, television shows, music videos, and nightmares. It became the universal symbol of modern travel, the silhouette that said flight to an entire planet. And it started because a timber merchant from Seattle thought he could build a better seaplane than the one he'd paid $10,000 for in 1916. That is the Ark. From a wooden plane in a Lake Union boathouse to the Queen of the Skies carrying 400 people across the Atlantic. And it is one of the most extraordinary stories of human ambition and engineering audacity that history has ever recorded. Now, before we get to number 1, I want to ask you something. Did your grandfather ever talk about the first time he flew? Because there is a generation of Americans, people who grew up in the 1940s and 50s, who remember exactly what it felt like the first time they boarded a propeller-driven airliner and how their entire understanding of the world changed when they looked down from 15,000 feet and realized how small everything was. Drop a comment below. What's the oldest airplane story in your family? I read every single one, and some of them have become the most interesting research rabbit holes of my career. Number 1. The decision that almost destroyed Boeing and accidentally saved the future of aviation. By the 1990s, Boeing had been the dominant force in commercial aviation for 3 decades. The 737, 747, 757, 767, and 737 families covered every segment of the market. Boeing's engineers were the best in the world. Its manufacturing processes were legendary, and its relationship with airlines was so deep that most carriers had entire maintenance departments trained exclusively on Boeing aircraft. And then, in 1997, Boeing did something that shocked everyone in the aerospace industry. It merged with McDonnell Douglas, its last remaining American commercial aviation competitor. On the surface, this made perfect sense. McDonnell Douglas was struggling, its aircraft were falling behind technologically, and its airline customers were defecting to Boeing anyway. Absorbing it would eliminate competition and add defense contracts. What Boeing's leadership did not fully anticipate was what would happen when 2 fundamentally different corporate cultures were forced together. McDonnell Douglas had survived for decades by relentless cost-cutting and financial discipline, what its critics called a finance company that happened to make airplanes. Boeing had survived by betting everything on engineering excellence, by spending whatever it took to build the best aircraft in the world. After the merger, the McDonnell Douglas financial culture gradually, almost imperceptibly, began to dominate. Engineers who raised concerns about safety or quality were told to think about costs. Programs that needed more time for testing were accelerated to meet delivery schedules. The long-term engineering philosophy that had built the 747 was quietly being replaced by a quarterly earnings philosophy that had destroyed McDonnell Douglas. The consequences of this cultural shift would not become visible for another 20 years. When 2 Boeing 737 MAX aircraft fell out of the sky in 2018 and 2019, killing 346 people, and the investigation revealed that cost pressures had influenced the development of a flight control system that pilots hadn't been properly trained to handle. The grounding of the 737 MAX, the congressional hearings, the billions of dollars in compensation, the criminal investigation, All of it traced back to that slow cultural corrosion that began in the years after the McDonnell-Douglas merger. The company that William Boeing built with obsessive quality control, that rejected furniture with invisible flaws, that spent $16 million of its own money on a prototype nobody had ordered. That company had, somewhere along the way, forgotten what it was. The tragedy of Boeing's recent decades is not a story of sudden failure. It is a story of gradual forgetting. And if Boeing is to reclaim the greatness it once embodied, the greatness of those engineers who barrel-rolled a prototype jetliner over Lake Washington to sell airplanes, who built the B-29 when everyone said it couldn't be done, who designed the 747 knowing it might bankrupt the company, it will have to remember what William Boeing understood from the very beginning. The airplane doesn't care about your quarterly earnings report. The airplane only cares whether you built it right. And that lesson, learned in a wooden boathouse on Lake Union in 1916, is the most important lesson in the history of American aviation. I want to know something from you. If you were running Boeing today, what's the one thing you would change first? Not the products, the culture. Because that's really the question, isn't it? Drop your answer in the comments. I have a feeling this is going to be one of the best comment sections we've ever had on this channel. And if this story made you see airplanes differently, if you'll never look up at a 747 or a 737 the same way again, then share this video with one person who loves aviation history. One person. That's all I'm asking. Because stories like this deserve to be heard, and the people who built these machines deserve to be remembered. From a wooden seaplane on a Seattle lake to the aircraft that carry 400 people across oceans at 35,000 feet, this is Boeing. And this is what human beings can build when they refuse to accept the limits of what's possible.